Our first story today comes from Apple Insider, and the title here is What a New Threat Report Says About Mac Malware in 2024.
What do you, Jerry? Macs don't get malware.
I
What are
know,
you talking about?
Mac. So that was the thing that surprised the heck out of me was I thought Macs couldn't get malware.
I thought by law, like
Yeah, yeah. Like Steve Jobs must be just spinning in his grave.
obviously we're being facetious.
Yeah. It's a kind of an interesting report, and it really highlights that Macs are kind of going through what I would characterize as the same kind of industrialization of malware as many other platforms. But the report also points out that there's some kind of important distinctions as compared to like Windows malware, where Windows malware has lots of different different attack vectors, and what they're saying in this report is that most of the methods that this malware ends up on or infecting Macs is through social engineering. It's not
Yeah.
necessarily through technical attacks. It's not. By the way, they don't say that that is exclusively the case. They do point out that there were a few instances of vulnerabilities that malware was taking advantage of. Although it sounds like that was predominantly privilege escalation. It was still, I think, even in those instances, using uh, social engineering to actually land on the system. The thing that I thought interesting is that a lot of IT people these days are using Macs,
Yeah.
and a lot of administrators are using Macs, and a lot of by the way, there's some goodness in that in terms of security. You're typically not susceptible to many of the same kinds of lateral movement attacks that you would see in a Windows environment, and that's goodness when you got your IT administrators with elevated rights and access to systems. That's not a terrible thing, but I think it also has perhaps created a bit of a false sense of security. And one of the things they point out in this post is that there are the malware, I should say, the malware types that they're seeing are Infostealers. So they're
Right.
not necessarily destructive type. I think they do point out that there is ransomware attacking Macs, but they point out that it's predominantly Infostealers. You know, password capture, secrets, pulling secrets down, copying clipboards, that sort of thing, which is not
Yeah. It's
something
a
you'd want to have happen on an administrator workstation.
no. It's interesting. There's a couple thoughts on here, and I've got some familiarity with running Macs in the enterprise. I've done both Windows Macs. In general, I would say that the Mac malware environment has not been nearly as active as Windows because lots of reasons. I don't think
Mm-hmm.
it's just the inherent capabilities of Mac, though they're not bad. I think that for a long time, the bad guys didn't see the market share was worth going after Macs, and now that's starting to change.
Right.
I think you were hinting at something that I think, which is that a lot of high value targets use Macs. So you usually can get more bang for the buck if you can land on a Mac in many cases, I think. The other thing I would say is the manageability from an enterprise perspective is not as robust as a Windows environment. Now, that's a pro con, right? You've got that whole trust relationship and you've got all those tools out there, but I would say it's not. I would say the Mac ecosystem for manageability is not as mature from an enterprise perspective as you see with Windows. The other thing I would say is that the security software is not nearly as robust for Mac as you see for Windows. You go look at a piece of software, let's just pick on an EDR provider, and you go look at, and they run on Mac and Windows endpoints, amongst others. And, they have their laundry list of capabilities. You start looking at the asterisks, there's a lot of them of Windows only, Windows only, Windows only, Windows only, that they don't exist on the Mac. So there's a whole kind of balanced trade off of ecosystem here. But I do think it's important that people understand that Macs are not invulnerable and they do have ways to be attacked, especially third party software, browsers, other things on the system can be attacked. This particular article seems to mainly focus on the operating system side of things, which is fine and it's important. But I think there's also a lot of third-party apps that can be attacked on various Macs and whatnot. In general, I think Macs are decently secure systems. They have a lot of smart things, which is why this report, I think, is saying the majority of the successful attacks are using some sort of social engineering to convince the user to do something they shouldn't. And in an enterprise environment, that sort of whole concept of should somebody have admin versus not have admin comes into play with Macs, but it's a little more complicated in some ways. So I could sort of soapbox on this one for a little while, but I think the key takeaway for me is people need to realize Macs can be successfully attacked today.
Yeah, exactly. That was the thing that I wanted to impress on here, is that it is, there's no magic. It is a failable system. However, again, they, as you mentioned, they point out that most of these malware strains, unless they trip over some vulnerability that hasn't been patched yet, they're really relying on people to install something with elevated privileges, to turn off some security setting and enable the malware to actually do its thing. So, what there were really two recommendations in this post, just mitigations. One was education, which I think we've talked about this to death. That can take you so far, and then more sophisticated security tools like EDR. But as you just pointed out, a lot of the capabilities around are baked into EDR are focused on Windows-based threats, because that's where the attackers are. But I would expect over time, if there is a significant shift from I don't think we'll ever see a shift away from Windows attacks. But if we start to see an increase in attacks on Macs, I think we would see a corresponding increase in sophistication of the tools available. But there'll be some lag. I mean, it's just the way the world works.
Yeah, that's true. I also think it's fairly common for executives to have their preferential operating system, and sometimes that's not what the mainline operating system is in the company. And now I'm dealing with a mixed environment that I may not have parity from a security and manageability and logging and visibility standpoint, which can lead to some interesting problems from a manageability standpoint.
Yeah, 100%.